Well, I've always felt since I was a young kid that when I met certain people, there was almost a sheen to them. There was a shadow, of depth. Some people have it and some people don't. And I've always been really impressed whether someone was a musician or just a wise person. There was a real depth to their presence.
Hey everybody, it's Mike Jeffers, Chicago Jazz Magazine, chicagojazz.com, and welcome to another episode of Around Town. This is a special one here. I have David Bloom. I'm sure many of you know David Bloom, the Bloom School of Jazz, 47 years, and a musician, composer, arranger, incredible educator. He's got a brand new recording out called Shadow of a Soul that we're going to talk about today. It's got 15 tracks on there, original tunes, and of course his longtime collaborator Cliff Colnot is along with him arranging some of these incredible pieces that we're going to talk all about. So David, welcome to Around Town. I'm glad that we're actually talking virtually. I haven't seen you since the shutdown, but I'm going to do that in person at some point, but I'm glad we can make this happen, and congratulations on this recording.
Thank you, and thanks for having me.
Oh, absolutely. So let's just get right into it. Shadow of a Soul. I love the press info that I got on this, the advance on it, but I want you to talk all about it. But really, the reason why you call it Shadow of Your Soul and Shadow of a Soul, and the passion, the individuality, which also is obviously present in all your teaching as well. But talk a little bit about just the title in general.
Well, I've always felt since I was a young kid that when I met certain people, there was almost a sheen to them. There was a shadow, of depth. Some people have it and some people don't. And I've always been really impressed whether someone was a musician or just a wise person. There was a real depth to their presence. And so what I've tried to do with the composing of Shadow of a Soul is to have as many different types of moods, that I could think of. And I wrote 90% of that during COVID. I wrote about 44 tunes during COVID. And it was funny. The title tune, Shadow of a Soul, I wrote the A section of that in 1974. And I played that with Larry Gray, who was a student of mine at the time. And I'd play flute, I'd play flute and guitar, and he was playing bass. And we played a restaurant called Cafe Neo in Hyde Park. And we played that tune. And I noticed that people stopped eating. And I realized at that time, if you can get between someone's fork and their mouth, you're doing something.
Mm-hmm.
So about 2 years ago, I wanted to record that, and I felt that 8 bars wasn't really enough,
Mm-hmm.
so I wrote a bridge to it, and I couldn't be happier with it. I mean, Cliff arranged it for upright bass and like 4 or 5 cellos and then violins. I mean, it to me it sounds like a Hollywood, score for a great movie.
It does. It does.
Yeah.
Well, and the arrangements on this recording, outside of the compositions, the arrangements. I mean, obviously you've worked with Cliff, and I mean he's a mastermind of all this stuff. But I mean, my gosh, he really brought even more out of the composition. I think. I don't know how you feel, but I was just listening to it. There's so many layers, so many textures, and so much stuff. It just brings the melodies out, brings the themes out even stronger.
I completely agree with you. um, I look at the arrangements as a context where melodies can live. And if you've listened to even pop music or whatever, and you hear different arrangements of the same tune, it's almost like having, the backdrop of South Pacific behind one tune, and then you have a cityscape, depending upon the orchestration, the mood, the groove, and the tempo. Those
Mm-hmm.
are so critical. Tempo is something that is not really thought about and used with the specificity that you need. I mean, even 2 clicks, 3 clicks can make a huge difference in the mood. It can sound like you can make it sound like the melody is real pushy.
Yeah.
You can sound like it's dragging, or it can sound like it's in that sweet spot. And that's not always easy for a lot of musicians to get to. A lot of times when I go out and hear music, I always hear that they're off by a few clicks in
Mhm.
terms of the sweet spot.
Well, that's something that I know you and I have talked about when I studied with you a little bit too, and when we would talk and things like that. And I know that's something you talk about in school, and that's something that even though I went to a fairly large music school, I didn't hear it that way. I would never hear it that way, but it makes so much sense because if all of you are listening to a tune and it's in the pocket and it's in the pocket and it feels, I mean, it doesn't happen all the time, but when it happens and it's locked in, it really, that's the song. That's what the composer really actually wanted, right? So it must have been incredibly important for you to make sure you nailed these things. But I think that the interesting part about it is, how did you go about the process of actually figuring out? I mean, once you lay in layers and once you lay in the arrangements and stuff, I mean, I'm sure you probably fluctuated the tempos even in the recording process, right? Just to find out where exactly you wanted it.
Yeah, normally with Cliff, he wants to have that pretty much nailed down. So the tempi on
Mm.
that CD are pretty much. There were a couple times where I might have taken it up or down 3 or 4 points because I just said this doesn't really feel just the way I wanted, and he would uh, kind of in an annoyed way change the click, you know. But um, yeah, I think that being I think if someone has an idea for the mood and the groove and what are they really trying to get across,
Mm-hmm.
and then they narrow it down to maybe 15 clicks, and they say this can work at 85 and it also works at 100, but after that it sounds pushy and not musical. And once you understand that, and this is a good lesson for anybody who's putting a set together, once you know that range where something sounds, convincing, you can start, tweaking the tempi for your set to make everything work. Because if you have another tune that is really working great at 85, you don't want to have a redundancy of the tempi. So
Right.
you might take the other tune to like even 90 or 89, and it makes a huge difference. I
Yep.
mean, sometimes many of the kind of the magic of music is unknown to the listener in terms of the specifics, but the overall vibe, if you like, or mood, that is known. So
Mm-hmm.
they may not know why that works. They may not know why the sus chord really brings the melody up here. They may not understand the actual technical specifics, but they do understand the mood. In other words, most people, an old grandmother at like 85 years old, if she hears someone singing out of tune, she's going to know something's wrong. She may not say it's out of tune. Or if someone has bad time, if they're rushing the lyrics, this vocalist, people will hear it and they may not be able to identify it, but they'll hear it.
Yeah.
That something's just not right.
Yeah. Well, I will say this, and you and I could talk about this for like 4 hours, but I will say this, there's a couple of commercials that are playing that I saw during the football games where somehow they're probably getting millions of views, and all of the vocals are completely out of tune for some reason, and they ran, it's terrible. I can't even, I remember the tune only because it's horrible, but hey, there you go. So I digressed on that one, but let's get back into this because, we've got a short amount of time here, but I want to make sure everybody goes and checks this out. It's on fireandformrecords.com. Of course, that's your record label. Shadow of a Soul. So, you have 15 tracks on here, and you have some that have a smaller breakdown of an ensemble, some that are just large ensembles. And you and I talked before we even came on. You did all of these in a very short amount of time from a recording standpoint, where it probably would take somebody over a year to do this many tunes, 15, let alone you ended up recording X amount of tunes, which we'll talk about now. But what was the process like? You must have had an idea of exactly who you wanted on the recording. So at least you lined all of that up, and then you just made it happen in a very short window.
Well, it's interesting, my creative process. Some of the tunes, as a couple, two or three of the tunes I had written A sections for, like 30, 40 years ago. And I decided that I really need a bridge. I don't want to just do it. And what Cliff wrote on that tune, Shadow of a Soul, and he had that oboe come in on the bridge. And in terms of that oboe, plus what I had written, plus the strings, I mean, I was Steve Weeder, the engineer, and I were sitting in the studio listening back, a week later, because I went in for like weeks to mix it with him, and we were both just blown away. He turned that thing up, and it just sounded like a major level movie theme. I think a lot of the music I write, is very moody. It's moody music, and cinematic. It's kind of music in search of a movie.
Well, you also, I mean, just from knowing you and hearing you teach and hearing you perform and hearing some of your other recordings, everything you write has a meaning behind it too. You're not just writing stuff to write stuff. I mean, you have a meaning behind this, just like this whole concept of this recording too. So, I mean, you wrote how many tunes? 44 tunes during COVID, during the lockdown. I mean, but they all have meanings. I mean, this recording is put together with deep meanings behind all of the compositions and the whole theme of the entire recording. I mean, but that's you, right? I mean, and that's actually what the recording is about, is finding your passion, finding your individuality, finding out. To me, it's always like, at the end of my life, am I going to be able to say I did everything that I could possible with the talents I have? And I mean, it feels like, to me, that's kind of the theme of this whole recording.
Yeah. I mean, good way to put it. I mean, the way I would write is if I, this tune, for example, Fatal Honey, with the flute, bass flute, and that tune. That tune is kind of about my my romance history,
Fatal Honey.
Yeah. Being drawn to situations that really didn't work out too well. So for example, in that tempo was very, very slow, and it's interesting. The slower a tune is, the more the harmony really comes out. If you have a tune at like 180 or 190, and you have nice chords and all that, they don't scream out like they do at 60 or 70.
Yep.
So if you really want to highlight, deep color, you're not going to do it well at a fast tempo.
Yeah.
Then the chords are not going to come out. I mean, it's first of all, when things are going that fast, a lot of times the chord's gone in like 1 second. Versus if you have some beautiful chords at 60, people get kind of lavish themselves in the harmony. I mean, it's like it's very interesting just how much time you're giving a person with a particular sound. In other words, I remember I saw this movie called The Life of Pi, and it had my favorite animal, which is a Bengal tiger. And never do you look at a Bengal tiger for like an hour and a half.
Right.
If you're at the zoo, you go by, you take a look for 10 or 15 seconds, you move on. But when you take a look at anything, for so long, you really get, you see things you never did. It's like going to a movie you saw 2 weeks ago, and you cannot believe the plot points that you've missed. Not the dressing, the plot points, because you got distracted. You thought about something. It's embarrassing, but it's the same thing with listening to, one of these tunes, you listen to it 10 times, you're going to hear a whole bunch of things you didn't hear the first or second or third.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing that I mentioned at the beginning of this. I mean, this is one of those recordings that, you listen over and over, but really what I love to do is I like to listen in a dark room or shut my eyes and just like sit somewhere and just really get inside of what's happening. A lot of times, and I brought this up to somebody yesterday, actually, who's performing a jazz thing in a sanctuary and at a church. And when you hear somebody play in a club, if you go to a church and hear the same group and you close your eyes, you hear the reverberate. It's totally different. It's a completely different experience. And with this recording, there's so many textures, so many layers, and so many themes that this is something that, to your point, it's almost like you need to see this movie. You need to listen to this many, many times and just to kind of digest what's happening. And then knowing the meaning behind the recording, I think then you're going to really feel it stronger and stronger every time you hear it.
Right. Right. Yeah. I recommend for anyone. Whether it's Coltrane or me, you listen to a tune. I tell my students, listen to this solo twice a day for a week,
Yeah.
and listen to this track. And, one time, listen, what is the piano player doing for the whole tune? What's the bass player doing? What's the drummer doing? And you really start getting into the intricacies of listening and responding.
Mm-hmm.
Some bebop type drummers don't do anything but play time. And they're good at that, but they're not kind of the organic Elvin Jones, listening more to what's going on and letting the soloist, at least do half of the navigation. And then you might want to nudge the soloist to go someplace that they wouldn't normally go. And that's the responsibility of a great rhythm section.
Let's talk a little bit about who's on the recording. Dave Liebman's on there, some very familiar names, Rob Parton, Victor Garcia, but there's some other names on there too that I recognize, but I had never heard perform. And so tell us who's on that recording that there's so many that stand out really.
Well, Konstantin Alexander is a trumpet player who I did not know until the session, and Cliff, found him somehow, and very impressive.
Yeah.
I mean, really just a fluent player. Ryan Cohn plays many piano solos. He was a student of mine for about 20 years. And then, the Rob Parton, who's been on tons of our record. I'm really happy that we have Kahari Parker,
Yeah,
who's on this record with Jewel. Another record. I produced 4 records, last year, and one was with Jewel, and we co-wrote tunes. So there's like country, there's country tunes. I'll send you that too.
Yeah, I would love to hear that.
Yeah, because there's some smoking stuff on that.
Oh man, I bet.
Yeah, yeah.
Who's the trombone player that's on this as well? Steve Duncan?
Steve Duncan.
Steve Duncan, that's right.
Yeah, yeah. For my money, he's one of the top features on the CD.
Yeah.
It's just really, really good. He plays stuff that sounds important and expensive. not cheap and frivolous.
So you recorded all of this in the span of how long? Because we were talking, you recorded how many tunes in the span of
30 tunes between June 18th and June 26th of 20 where are we now? 2021. 20 no. Yeah.
Okay. So really coming out of the pandemic, you got right to work then on this recording because, as soon as you can get people into a room together, it sounds like you guys started recording.
Yeah. I wrote, some days Cliff would call me up because he did worse than I did during the COVID. I was out on my bike riding around and composing. I had probably the most creative period, in my life during COVID. See, he'd call me up because he was really bored and say, man, will you send me something? And I said, well, I'll send you 8 bars later today.
Yeah.
And a few of these ended up ended up being interludes. On this CD, I have full-fledged tunes, and then I have these short interludes. Um, and I really, they're almost like palate cleansers.
Mm,
Like samba. Um, and then there's full-fledged tunes like The Way I See It, which is one of my favorite tunes. I'm playing alto flute on that.
right.
Um, yeah, but some of these are like Fatal Honey. These are very short tunes. I'm a very firm believer in do not practice on the listener's time. You know, present what you got to present and get the hell out. You know, no, I mean, some people it's runaway ego.
Yeah.
They just keep playing on and on. And I was just at a set the other night, and the tenor player who I hadn't heard before, um, very, very, very good instrumentalist. I mean, but he was just playing stuff that just didn't hold together.
Mm-hmm.
He's someone we both know who you turned me on to. I won't mention his name now, but exceptionally good player, but really so little poetry, so little storytelling. And I think a lot of people, they respond if a tempo is like at 170, 180, they respond Pavlovianly. They just have to play eighth notes. They just couldn't think of playing like whole notes tied.
Yeah.
There's just a little trigger, and it just turns on, and they're just playing what I call a lot of verbiage.
Mm-hmm.
Just you know, and they're missing two or three gears they could play to get to that release place. If they played like a whole notes or quarter note triplets or something, just to float before they go to that conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
So they're just missing opportunities.
I think it's a great way to say it. You're telling a story when you're soloing, when you're writing, when you're doing any of that, and you're telling a story. And I think a lot of people sometimes they don't think that way. They're like, okay, I got to fill up this thing and I want to play off of this guy and that guy, but they're not thinking they're telling a story. And stories oftentimes start off in one way, set up, you and I could talk about this, I know, for another hour too. So I'm trying
Right.
to keep it short because we're running out of
Right.
time. But and that, to your point, that's something that I think a lot of people, even really, really, really well-known people, continuously keep thinking about as they keep getting better and better and better. It's just something that sometimes people just don't even conceive, and then somebody has to actually tell them, hey, you're telling a story here. And if your story's over in two choruses, then it's over, man. Don't take a third chorus, because now you're writing a trilogy with no ending here. Like, what are we talking about?
Well, a lot of times people, even Lee Morgan on a record called like Someone in Love, and they're playing a tune called Johnny's Blue, a minor blues. And he just plays just fantastically, but then he plays a 5 chorus epilogue.
Yeah.
And you can hear him running out of gas. So we're talking about name players. I mean,
Yeah.
legendary players don't always play poetic solo.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Yeah.
you can hear great named players playing okay. You
Mm-hmm.
can also hear them play stuff that sounds miraculous.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of this has to do with how they feeling that day. Did they have a fight with their girlfriend? Whatever that can, and also how people respond to what happens to them.
Mm-hmm.
Something might take you deeper inward, and something like might take you, to play much more in a shallowly, if that's a word, more shallow than you would normally play. So all kinds of things affect people.
Yeah. Well, we have to get back on and we need to talk about concepts and all of that stuff at some point, but we're about to wrap up. We got a couple of minutes left. So I want to thank everybody for watching. David, thank you for jumping on with me. Shadow of a Soul with arrangements by Cliff Colnot, 15 incredible tracks, fireandformrecords.com. Of course, the Bloom School of Jazz is there, and everybody should look that up and go study with David and hit him up as well, because getting a one-on-one with David and bringing your instrument in and talking about all this stuff in person is it just starts to change the way you completely conceive how to play. Trust me, I've done it, and it completely changed the way I was conceiving how to play. So, hey, thank you for being on, David. I really appreciate it, and congratulations on this recording.
Well, thank you for having me, and I wish you luck back with everything you're doing. Because it seems like you made a big change recently.
I did, but we're back.
Yeah.
We're back up and running, and we're up and running. So, all
That's
right. And of course, I want to thank everybody for watching. And as I always say, everything's on ChicagoJazz.com. And until next time, hopefully I will see you all out on the scene.